The torches burn low, their smoke curling into the rafters of marble halls. You stand at the threshold of the emperor's palace, where the night itself seems to tremble. The air is thick, perfumed with roses, but spoiled by the sharp bite of wine and the musk of too many bodies pressed together. A faint music drifts through the corridors, but it does not soothe. It pulses like a heartbeat, relentless, discordant, warning you of something you should not see. Inside, the scene unfolds. Golden lamps flicker against silken curtains, and shadows twist across the walls like restless spirits. You see senators' wives, adorned not in dignity, but in shame, paraded as though they were offerings at an altar. You see sisters seated at the emperor's side, their faces pale, their titles blurred into whispers of something forbidden. The great halls of Rome, once the stage of triumphs and solemn oaths, are said to have been turned into chambers of vice, into brothels where power and humiliation were sold as spectacle. And there, at the center of it all, lies Caligula. Reclining on ivory cushions, eyes glittering with something fevered, something unmoored. He does not look like a man. He looks like a god enthroned, a cruel divinity who bends flesh and loyalty to his will. His voice echoes like commandment, and when he laughs, it is not with mirth but with mockery, a sound that cuts deeper than the blade of any assassin. This is the image the ancients will pass down to you, an emperor who knew no boundaries, no bloodline too sacred, no law too holy, no decency too fragile to be shattered. A ruler whose legacy drips with scandal, whispered as incest, as orgies, as the desecration of everything Rome held dear. But step closer, and a question coils in the silence: are you truly witnessing the sins of a mad tyrant? Or only the venom of those who sharpened their pens to murder him in memory? Was Caligula the monster history insists, or was his throne dismantled by rumor, by politics, by hatred turned into myth? What you have seen is only the surface, only the shadow that Rome cast upon its most infamous ruler. Tonight, we descend into the heart of that darkness. Tonight, you will learn not only what Caligula was accused of, but also what the evidence, and the brutal politics of empire, truly say. He was not born a monster. He was born into a dynasty gilded by triumph and poisoned by blood. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, son of Germanicus, the general adored by Rome's legions, grandson of the formidable Agrippina the Elder, great-grandson of Augustus himself. From his infancy he was raised in camps, not palaces, cradled among soldiers who saw in him the promise of Rome's future. They dressed him in a child's version of their uniform, tiny boots that clattered against the stone as he followed their march. It was from those boots that the nickname emerged, Caligula, Little Boots. At first it was affectionate, a soldier's jest, but in time it would cling to him like a curse, outlasting the honor of his given name. The people adored him before he ever wore the purple. To them, he was the heir of Germanicus, the fallen hero whose death had left Rome in mourning. To see Caligula rise was to see the shadow of Germanicus restored. When he ascended the throne in the year 37, the city erupted in joy. Crowds flooded the streets, sacrifices burned in every temple, men and women alike whispered that at last, a savior had come to sweep away the shadows of Tiberius's reign, a reign remembered for cruelty, for fear, for whispers of perversion on the Isle of Capri. In those first months, the empire basked in a light that seemed new. Caligula was generous. Lavish games filled the arenas, debts were forgiven, prisoners freed. His public image was dazzling. For once, the emperor looked not like a tyrant but like a benefactor, beloved as few had ever been. But the glow dimmed quickly. A sudden illness, its cause never known, struck him down within months of his rise. Some said poison, others whispered a brush with death itself. When he recovered, he was changed. His generosity curdled into extravagance, his charm into cruelty, his laughter into something shrill, unhinged. Rome watched as its darling, its shining hope, began to twist into something darker, something dangerous. And it is from this moment that the rumors gather like vultures. Stories of excess, of madness, of depravity. Tales whispered in the Senate and scrawled later in ink by men who had every reason to make his memory grotesque. Our knowledge of Caligula's reign comes not from neutral voices but from hostile pens, Suetonius, writing nearly a century later, hungry for scandal. Cassius Dio, layering drama upon hearsay, Philo and Josephus, each with their own resentments, their own angles. None of them watched without bias. None of them reported without intent. So we must walk carefully here, for every tale may be truth, or venom. Every account may be revelation, or fabrication. Yet it is through these treacherous voices that Caligula has reached us, shaped into the image of a ruler who was not merely hated, but demonized. If you have followed this descent so far, ask yourself, are you content to let history lie to you? Or do you want to uncover the shadows and sift out the truth? If you want the veil lifted, subscribe now. And if you choose not to, then leave your reason in the comments, tell us why you would rather turn away from the darker truths of the past. They say the rot began within his own bloodline. Among the many whispers that cling to Caligula like a shroud, none are more poisonous than the claim that he lay with his own sisters. Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla, and most of all, Drusilla. To the Romans, incest was not only a sin of the flesh, it was a symbol of political corruption, a mark of a family consumed by its own ambition. To accuse an emperor of it was to brand him not simply immoral, but monstrous, unfit to rule. The stories were told with relish. Suetonius, writing decades later, claimed that Caligula flaunted his transgressions in public, that he paraded his sisters as though they were empresses, that Drusilla herself was treated as his wife in all but name. Cassius Dio echoed the charge, painting scenes of scandal within the palace walls. Philo and Josephus, each watching from the provinces, added their own dark inflections, feeding the image of a household unbound by Roman law, desecrating the very sanctity of family. But was it true? The evidence is as fragile as the papyrus it was written on. None of these men saw the events firsthand. All wrote under the weight of politics, vendetta, or moralizing zeal. What we know for certain is that Caligula raised his sisters to unprecedented prominence. Coins were struck bearing their images, an honor few women of Rome had ever been given. In public processions, they rode beside him, not behind. And Drusilla, above all, was elevated. When she died in 38 CE, Caligula's grief was extravagant. He ordered the empire to mourn her as though she had been his wife, decreed her a goddess, and referred to her as his divine consort. To the Romans, this alone was enough to inflame suspicion. No emperor before him had dared to display such intimacy with female kin. In a culture where women were expected to remain shadows in politics, such visibility was scandalous. And where scandal lingers, rumor takes root. Modern historians tread carefully here. Some argue that the incest allegations were slander, the kind of story political enemies sharpened to justify Caligula's downfall. Others suggest that while outright incest may never be proven, Caligula's treatment of Drusilla blurred the lines of propriety so dangerously that the leap to accusation was inevitable. In either case, the tale serves less as evidence of his private life than as a weapon wielded against his name. You stand in the court of whispers, hearing the accusations echo through time. Are you content to accept them as fact, or do you see the hand of propaganda painting a villain to serve its own ends? If you are fascinated by how rumor can destroy reputations, subscribe now. If not, then step into the comments and confess why you would rather remain in the dark. The palace corridors no longer whispered of ceremony, but of shame. Imagine it, marble halls that once echoed with triumphal processions now lit by the low, flickering glow of lamps, as if they were staging grounds for something darker, something obscene. The story comes from Suetonius, a biographer with a taste for scandal. Caligula, they say, transformed the very heart of Rome's power into a brothel. Senators' wives, women born to command respect through lineage and alliance, were paraded like commodities, displayed in rooms where velvet drapery replaced dignity, and where pleasure was currency paid not with coin, but with humiliation. You stand at the threshold of this claim, and the air feels heavy. Is this the emperor's desire for decadence, or a calculated weapon? To degrade a man's wife in public imagination was to strip him of his virtue, his standing, his very masculinity. To suggest that Rome's most sacred halls had become theaters of lust was not simply an accusation of immorality, it was a blade drawn against the entire senatorial class. For the Romans, honor was not private, it was political, woven into the fabric of the republic-turned-empire. To sully the matrons of Rome, if true, would be nothing short of a symbolic war. And yet, as you peer closer, the outlines blur. For what greater insult could slanderers invent than this? Rome's elite lived in fear of shame, of whispers that could unravel dynasties. To paint Caligula as a man who defiled the sanctity of their women was to paint him not just as immoral, but as unfit to rule, a corrupter of the very state itself. It raises a darker possibility, that these stories were less a record of crime and more an act of political assassination, crafted not with daggers, but with words that cut even deeper. But consider the tension, was there truth buried in the scandal? We know Caligula delighted in testing the limits of Rome's traditions. He flaunted wealth, mocked institutions, and dared the Senate to oppose him. Would it be so unthinkable that he might have staged scenes of humiliation, not as lust, but as spectacle, an emperor's taunt, a performance of dominance meant to remind every rival that their private lives, even their marriages, were his to command? Here, fact and fiction merge in a haze of smoke and torchlight. Did the palace truly become a brothel, or was it only ever imagined as one, painted by those desperate to blacken his name? Either way, the damage was done. The rumor outlived the man, outlived his reign, outlived even those who invented it. Once planted, the idea of Caligula as the corrupter of Roman matrons became immortal, a story whispered through centuries. And now, the question turns to you. Think about it, if this was your family's honor on the line, would you stay silent? Would you allow your sister, your wife, your mother, to be dragged through history as a pawn in another man's war? Silence, in such moments, is complicity. Don't stay silent here either. Subscribe. Or at least explain why you won't, down below. At the feasts of Rome, power was never simply measured in coin or armies, it was displayed in ritual, in excess, in the theater of dining. To eat with an emperor was not only to share bread and wine. It was to be placed within a performance, a drama where the ruler stood at the center and all eyes bent toward him. The ancient writers tell us that under Caligula, this performance took on grotesque extremes. They paint a picture of banquets where the line between entertainment and humiliation was deliberately blurred, where guests were made to witness not the refinement of culture, but the spectacle of debasement. Suetonius claims that at these feasts, men and women were forced to endure the unendurable, acts of public obscenity that mocked their dignity. Imagine senators seated at marble tables, their wives beside them, only to be compelled to watch scenes of depravity unfold under the emperor's command. To refuse was impossible. To watch was torment. In such tales, the banquet ceased to be a meal and became a stage where reputations, family honor, and even Rome's moral fabric were shattered at the emperor's whim. But here we must pause. The Romans were not new to these kinds of stories. The feasting table had long been a theater of political rumor. Recall Tiberius, Caligula's predecessor, whose retreat to Capri became the setting for endless stories of grotesque debauchery, children, cruelty, perversion. These stories of Tiberius, whether exaggerated or real, set the stage for what would later be said about Caligula. In Rome, when an emperor fell out of favor, his dinner parties were the first to be reimagined as orgies of moral collapse. Banquets became the perfect symbol, food turned into gluttony, laughter into mockery, and intimacy into corruption. So when we hear about Caligula's public banquets of depravity, we must ask, was this truth, or a weapon sharpened after his death? The Romans feared moral decay as much as military defeat, and sexual scandal was one of the most effective tools of political assassination. To accuse an emperor of feasting upon shame rather than bread was to mark him as a tyrant unfit to rule. Yet, even if the tales are exaggerated, they reveal something profound about how Caligula was remembered. Whether true or not, the rumor itself had power. It was believed, repeated, etched into history, because it resonated with Rome's deepest anxieties, that their rulers, entrusted with the empire, could not only squander wealth but corrupt the very core of Roman honor. Now consider your own position, here in this moment. You've stayed with this story for 10 minutes. That means something. It means you're not merely curious, you are searching, reaching for the truth behind the myths. And yet, if you've not subscribed by now, ask yourself why. Do you not want the darker truths of history uncovered? Or do you simply prefer the comfort of forgetting? Drop your excuse in the comments, or admit you don't really want the truth about history. They say that Caligula did not merely fight the Senate with decrees and laws. He fought them in the bedroom. Ancient writers whisper of nights when the emperor would summon the most respected matrons of Rome, wives of consuls, daughters of generals, women whose families carried the weight of centuries, and strip them of their dignity before their peers. They say he took them publicly, sometimes at banquets, sometimes in private chambers, and then, like a cruel performer, returned them to their husbands with a mocking smile. To the Roman mind, this was not simply lust. It was war. For the Romans, sex had always carried a charge of power. To dominate another man's wife was not just adultery, it was conquest. It was the symbolic breaking of a bloodline, the corruption of a lineage that once prided itself on purity and strength. And when the man violating that sanctity was the emperor himself, the meaning deepened. Caligula was not only mocking his political opponents. He was branding them as weak. As less than men. Imagine, for a moment, the humiliation. You, a senator who had devoted your life to the Republic, whose family had bled for Rome, sit powerless as the emperor chooses your wife from the table. She is taken, defiled, returned as though she were a pawn in a game far larger than her. The pain was not only personal, it was political theater, staged for maximum impact. And the sources, of course, amplify this story. They depict him as a monster, a man who dissolved all barriers between public and private life, dragging the most intimate bonds of marriage and honor into the brutal arena of imperial politics. They make him a predator whose cruelty lay not only in what he did, but in the fact that he seemed to relish the shame it inflicted. But here lies the shadow of doubt. Was this truth, or was it crafted slander? Roman historians, writing after Caligula's assassination, had every incentive to justify his murder. And what easier way than to accuse him of the ultimate violation, turning the sanctity of Rome's noblest households into a mockery of power? After all, sexual rumors were a tried and true weapon. Tiberius, before him, had been painted as a perverse recluse on Capri. Nero, after him, would be accused of bedding his own mother. To destroy an emperor's legacy, you did not need evidence, you only needed whispers. And yet, there lingers a chilling possibility. What if the stories were true? What if the emperor, drunk on power, really did wield sex as a weapon, not for desire, but for humiliation? What if every rumor, every whispered tale, every shattered marriage bore the fingerprints of a ruler who believed Rome itself existed for his pleasure? That question, whether Caligula was merely the victim of propaganda or truly the architect of his own perversions, remains unanswered. But in that uncertainty, his shadow grows darker still. This is where history gets uncomfortable. If you want more than surface-level stories, hit subscribe. If you won't, then own up. Tell us in the comments why you don't value the truth. The transformation of Gaius Caligula into something more than a man, into a self-declared god, marks the apex of his legend. It is here that history and rumor entwine most tightly, for what could be more dangerous to Rome than a mortal who claimed to sit among the immortals? Ancient sources whisper that Caligula demanded temples, priests, and sacrifices in his honor. Not just as emperor, Rome was used to divine honors for its rulers, but as a living deity, present, breathing, and watching. The accounts grow darker. He would stroll through sacred chambers dressed as Jupiter, or Venus, or Apollo, shifting his identity as if to declare himself the embodiment of all gods at once. And then, the sexual rumors tie themselves to this divine theater. To wear the mantle of Venus was not innocent costume. It was provocation. To drape himself in the goddess's attire suggested he blurred not just the boundary between man and God, but between man and woman, between order and chaos, between reverence and mockery. His divinity was not holy, it was humiliating, a calculated insult to Rome's sense of balance. But pause here. Let us peel back the layers. Why would such stories flourish? Why would Rome fixate on the sexuality of divinity? Because for Romans, madness and lust were inseparable. A man who defiled the sacred order of the gods through sex was not merely immoral, he was a cosmic threat, a living rupture in the universe itself. And yet, when we scrutinize the evidence, the god complex appears less as an established fact, and more as a narrative weapon. Suetonius and Cassius Dio record these tales with delight, but neither offers proof beyond hearsay. What if the so-called godhood was nothing more than political theater exaggerated by his enemies? What if the mad emperor image was carefully engineered to explain why he had to die? For his assassins, it was not enough to say he taxed too heavily or insulted senators. They needed to argue he had broken the very fabric of reality. They needed to say, he believed himself divine. He destroyed boundaries. He was unfit to live. And so, the God complex fits seamlessly into Rome's wider obsession with the trope of the mad king. Think of Nero, accused of performing as an actor, a woman, a bride. Think of Commodus, said to have played Hercules in the arena, degrading the empire with his fantasies. These figures were painted with the same brush, sexually deviant, theatrically divine, and mentally unhinged. It tells us more about Rome's anxieties than about Caligula himself. Rome feared what happened when to cut him down, they did not attack his policies, they attacked his body, his sex, his mind, and his claim to the heavens. So was Caligula a god? Perhaps in his own mind. Or perhaps only in the minds of those who wanted to crucify his memory long after his body was gone. Caligula demanded worship. I won't. I just ask for a subscribe. If that's too much, then at least confess in the comments why you refuse. The deeper you dig into Caligula's story, the more the ground shifts beneath your feet. What do we actually know, and what is the echo of rumor sharpened into propaganda? Suetonius, Cassius Dio, even Tacitus, these were not eyewitness accounts. They were written years, sometimes decades after Caligula's death. Men with their own loyalties, their own agendas, their own grudges against the Julio-Claudian line. And what better way to justify a violent assassination than to say, he was not just a tyrant, he was a monster. Look closer at the pattern. Stories of sexual depravity, of divine delusions, of humiliating the Senate, these aren't random. They are carefully chosen weapons. In Rome, to accuse someone of lust, madness, and sacrilege was not just scandal, it was the ultimate character assassination. It made the spilling of blood not only acceptable, but necessary. Did Caligula actually turn his palace into a brothel? Did he really force senators' wives into his bed? Or was it the Senate's revenge, taking back their honor by blackening his name for eternity? That is the paradox of history. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Caligula was no saint, no innocent, but the sexual horror stories say more about Rome's fears, Rome's politics, Rome's hunger to demonize a fallen ruler, than about the man himself. So when you picture Caligula, ask yourself this: are you seeing the emperor, or the shadow painted over him by those who needed him to die twice, once in his body, and once in memory? You've followed me this far into the shadows of Rome. Don't let the story end here. Subscribe, so you don't miss what comes next, and if you think the historians were right to damn Caligula forever, tell me why in the comments. Was he the monster, or just the scapegoat? Caligula's death should have been the end of his story. A knife in the dark, a body dragged through corridors, blood staining the marble floor of the Palatine. But for Caligula, death was only the beginning. His true afterlife was not in the tomb, but in the imagination of those who came after. Historians turned him into a cautionary tale. Playwrights shaped him into a grotesque caricature of power gone mad. Centuries later, filmmakers stripped away the nuance and left only the spectacle, the emperor as the embodiment of forbidden lust, cruelty, and divine delusion. From Renaissance stages to 20th century cinema, the name Caligula no longer meant emperor. It meant perversion. Why did this image endure? Because it gave audiences what they craved, an emperor who crossed every line, who shattered every taboo, who embodied the fears and fantasies that most societies dared not voice aloud. Madness. Incest. Bloodlust. To whisper his name was to summon the darkest possibilities of unchecked power. Rome had many tyrants. But Caligula alone became the cultural shorthand for unhinged decadence. He was transformed into a myth that said more about us than about him. We are drawn to tales of monsters not because they are true, but because they give shape to the chaos we fear within ourselves. That is why, 2,000 years later, the word Caligula still chills the air. Not as history, but as symbol. Not as man, but as warning. If you've walked this far into the abyss, ask yourself, do we keep Caligula alive because of what he did, or because of what we secretly want to see in him? Subscribe to Tale of History, and join me as we peel back more legends where myth and truth blur into shadow. So, was Caligula truly the most infamous ruler in history? Or was he the victim of Rome's most brutal smear campaign? That is the paradox that lingers in the silence after his story ends. Strip away the layers of blood and scandal, and you find not certainty, but shadow. A ruler remembered less for what he did, and more for what others wanted him to represent. In Caligula, history and myth bleed together. Perhaps that is the real horror, not the man himself, but the reminder of how easily memory can be twisted, how power can be reshaped into nightmare by the hands of those who write the record. This is Tale of History, where we strip away the lies, one scandal at a time. Subscribe now. Don't just consume the myths like everyone else. Be one of the few who demand the truth.